He wasn't supposed to be home that night, and he definitely wasn't supposed to be lying flat on his back breath, held under the guest room bed listening to his wife laugh softly, the way she hadn't laughed with him in months. But what he heard next didn't just break his heart. It rewrote everything he thought he knew about love, loyalty, and war. Mark Sullivan had built his life on control. Not the loud, domineering kind, the quiet, precise kind. The kind that turned small opportunities into million-dollar campaigns. The kind that made clients trust him with their scandals, their reputations, their secrets. Control was why his PR firm stood tall in Manhattan while others collapsed. Control was why he believed his marriage was safe. And control was exactly what slipped through his fingers the moment he stepped into his townhouse that night. The house was too quiet. Not empty, just wrong. Mark paused in the foyer, his hand still gripping his car keys. The faint glow from the living room spilled into the hallway, warm and inviting. But beneath it something else lingered, a sound that didn't belong. A low murmur, a man's voice. Mark's pulse slowed instead of quickening. Years of high-stakes negotiations had trained him not to react, only to observe. He set his keys down silently. Another sound, a soft laugh, Eleanor's laugh, but not the one she used with him. This one was softer, intimate, unfiltered. Mark moved toward the guest room, instinctively drawn not by fear, but by something colder, something sharper. The door was slightly ajar. He still has no idea, Eleanor said, her voice low, almost amused. Mark froze. A second voice responded, male, confident, unfamiliar. You're sure he'll sign? A pause. Then the sound of fabric shifting, a bed creaking. Mark's jaw tightened. Without thinking, he pushed the door open just enough to slip inside, silent, unseen. And then, driven by something primal, he lowered himself and slid beneath the bed. Dust clung to his shirt. The wood frame pressed cold against his back. Above him, shadows moved. He could see them, bare feet, a man's shoes. Eleanor's heels kicked carelessly aside. Mark didn't breathe. He trusts me, Eleanor said. That's his weakness. The words didn't hit like a punch. They landed like a blade, slow, deliberate, precise. The man chuckled, and after he signs, Eleanor exhaled almost lazily. It's done. The accounts will already be drained through the offshore channels. By the time he realizes what happened, everything will be legally protected. Mark's fingers curled into his palm. Offshore accounts, and the company the man asked. A pause. Then Eleanor's voice, cooler now. Colder. I'll take control through the transfer agreements. His shares will be worthless. He built it, but legally it'll be mine. Silence followed. Not the peaceful kind, the suffocating kind. Mark stared at the underside of the bed frame, his mind moving faster than his heartbeat. Not rage, not yet. Just clarity. The man shifted above him. You're ruthless, Eleanor. She laughed again. That same soft, unfamiliar laugh. You married me for a reason, Daniel. Daniel. The name clicked into place. Daniel Reeves, investor, occasional collaborator. Someone Mark had once considered bringing into a larger partnership. Someone who had sat at their dinner table. Someone who had looked him in the eye and smiled. Mark closed his eyes, not in pain, in calculation. What about the divorce? Daniel asked. Eleanor sighed. I'll file after everything is finalized. He'll be too busy trying to figure out what happened to fight it properly. And if he does, a pause. Then colder than anything she'd said before. He won't win. The word settled into Mark's chest like stone. Above him, movement again, a shift in weight, the unmistakable sound of intimacy. Mark didn't move, didn't react, didn't feel, because in that moment under the bed, beneath the illusion of his own life, something inside him didn't break. It changed. The man who had walked into that house was a husband. The man lying in the shadows now was something else. A strategist, a witness, a man who finally understood the game being played against him, and more importantly, a man who had just decided he was going to win. He waited until they left, listened to the door close, counted the seconds. Only then did Mark slide out from under the bed, his movements slow, deliberate. The room smelled like betrayal. He stood there for a long time, not grieving, not raging, thinking. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. The screen lit up his face in the dim room. And for the first time that night, Mark Sullivan smiled. Not with warmth, not with pain, but with purpose. The night didn't end when they left. For Mark Sullivan, it had only just begun. The silence they left behind wasn't empty, it was contaminated. Every surface in the guest room felt altered, as if truth itself had settled into the walls. The bed above him, once nothing more than furniture, had become a witness, and he had become something far more dangerous than a victim. He stepped out into the hallway slowly, each movement deliberate. His reflection in the mirror across the corridor looked unchanged. Tailored coat, composed expression, the same man who had walked into the house an hour ago, but his eyes were different, sharper, colder, more awake than they had ever been. Downstairs, the city hummed beyond the glass walls of their townhouse. New York City never slept, but tonight Mark understood why. Because beneath its lights and polished surfaces, there were always people like Eleanor, people who smiled in public and plotted in private. He replayed every word in his head. Offshore accounts, transfer agreements. He trusts me, that's his weakness. Each sentence wasn't just betrayal, it was structure, a plan, legal, calculated, designed not to destroy him emotionally, but to erase him financially. And that was what made it lethal. Mark walked into his study, closing the door softly behind him. The familiar scent of leather and paper grounded him. This room had always been his domain, where deals were made, where crises were solved, where narratives were controlled. Now it would become something else. A war room. He sat at his desk, fingers steepled beneath his chin. Think, he whispered. Not why. That question was useless. He needed how. How long had it been happening? How much had she already taken? How deep did Daniel Reeves go into his business? And most importantly, how close was he to losing everything? Mark reached for his laptop and opened it. The screen's glow cut through the darkness. His company accounts, personal finances, investment portfolios, everything looked normal, which meant nothing was. Eleanor wasn't careless. She wouldn't move large sums directly. She'd layer at shell companies, staggered transfers, legal instruments that looked harmless unless you knew exactly where to look. Mark exhaled slowly. Good, he murmured, because that meant one thing. She thought she was ahead. His phone buzzed suddenly on the desk. A message. Eleanor, running late tonight. Don't wait up. Mark stared at the screen. For a moment, just a moment, something human flickered beneath the surface. A memory. A version of her that had once meant something real. Then it was gone, replaced by clarity. He typed back, no problem. Take your time. 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. No reply. Of course not. She didn't need to convince him anymore. She thought she already had. Mark leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the window. He remembered the early days, the small apartment, the cheap wine, the way Eleanor used to sit across from him, listening as he talked about building something bigger than himself. She had believed in him then, or at least, she had been very good at pretending to. When did it change? He asked the empty room, but even as the question formed, he already knew the answer. It hadn't. This wasn't a transformation, it was a revelation. He stood abruptly, decision settling into his bones. No confrontation, not yet, because confrontation was emotional, and emotion was exactly what she expected. No, what he needed was distance, observation, proof. Mark moved through the house methodically. The bedroom, the closet, the bathroom. He wasn't searching blindly, he was studying patterns. Eleanor's things were immaculate as always. Organized, curated, controlled. But control left fingerprints. A second phone charger that didn't belong to him. A receipt tucked too carefully into a drawer. A faint scent different from her usual perfume. Subtle, but not invisible. Back in the study, Mark opened a drawer and pulled out a small black notebook. He hadn't used it in years. Not since the early days of his company, when every client detail, every strategy, every risk had been documented by hand. He flipped it open. Blank pages. Waiting. Then he picked up a pen. Eleanor Hart. He wrote her name slowly, deliberately, as if committing it to a case file instead of a marriage. Underneath he added Daniel Reeves. Then a third line. Objective total financial control. Mark paused. Then wrote one more. Countermeasure undetermined. He stared at the words for a long moment. Then almost unconsciously he smiled again, because the fear was gone, not suppressed, gone, replaced by something far more useful, focus. Hours passed. The city outside dimmed, then brightened again as night shifted toward morning. Mark didn't sleep. He worked, tracing connections, revisiting contracts, mentally mapping every possible vulnerability Eleanor could exploit. By the time the first light touched the skyline, he had reached one undeniable conclusion. She wasn't improvising. This had been planned for a long time, which meant there were records, and records could be found. The front door clicked open just after 6 a.m. Mark didn't move from his desk. He heard her heels first soft-controlled measured, then her voice. Mark light, casual, perfectly normal. He closed the notebook slowly. Yeah, he called back, his tone steady. In the study. A pause. Then footsteps approaching. Eleanor appeared in the doorway, framed by morning light. Flawless, composed, untouched by the night that had changed everything. You're up early? She said, offering a small smile. Mark looked at her. Really looked. And for the first time, he saw her clearly. Not as his wife, not as his partner, but as his opponent. Couldn't sleep, he replied. A beat of silence passed between them. Subtle, tense, invisible to anyone else. She stepped inside, setting her bag down. You should take a break, she said gently. You've been working too hard lately. The irony was almost impressive. Mark leaned back slightly, studying her face. Yeah, he said. Maybe you're right. Her smile softened. She believed him. Of course she did. Long night, he asked. Casual, direct. Her eyes didn't flicker. Just work, she said smoothly. You know how it is. Mark nodded once. I do. And he did. Better than she realized. Another pause. Then Eleanor stepped closer, resting a hand lightly on his shoulder. A familiar gesture. One that used to mean something. You trust me, right? She asked softly. The question hung in the air. Heavy, loaded, dangerous. Mark looked up at her, into her eyes, and for a brief second, he let her see exactly what she expected to see. A man who loved his wife. A man who had no idea. A man who was already losing. Of course I do, he said. Eleanor smiled. Relieved, victorious. She leaned down and kissed his cheek. Good, she whispered. Then she turned and walked away. Mark didn't move until he heard the bedroom door close. Then slowly, very slowly, his expression changed. The warmth vanished. The illusion dropped. And what remained was absolute. He reached for the notebook again, turned to the next page, and wrote, She asked if I trust her. A pause. Then beneath it, she still thinks I do. Mark closed the notebook. This wasn't the night he lost everything. This was the night he learned the rules. And from this moment forward, he wasn't reacting anymore. He was preparing. Silence. Mark Sullivan realized was not the absence of action. It was the most precise form of control. 3 days after the night under the bed, nothing in the house had changed. Eleanor still moved through their home with effortless grace, morning coffee placed beside his laptop light. Kisses before leaving for meetings, the occasional soft laughter, drifting through phone calls she never quite finished in his presence. To anyone watching, they were still perfect. To Mark, it was theater, and she was performing flawlessly. He played his role just as well. If Eleanor was the architect of illusion, Mark became its most convincing audience. He smiled when expected. He listened when required. He even reached for her hand once at dinner, just long enough for her to believe she was still in control. Because control, he now understood, wasn't about dominance. It was about timing. But behind the performance, everything had changed. The study became his command center, and I'd see him every evening after Eleanor went to bed. Mark sat in the dim glow of his desk lamp, reconstructing the life she thought she was dismantling. Not emotionally, structurally. He began with the obvious financial accounts. Personal, corporate, investment. At first glance, everything remained intact. But Mark had built his company from nothing. He knew where to look when something felt wrong. Patterns told stories. And Eleanor, for all her precision, had left patterns behind. The first anomaly appeared in a mid-tier subsidiary account, one that handled smaller international transactions. Nothing alarming, just irregular. A transfer slightly larger than usual. A routing path that felt unnecessarily complex. Mark leaned back, eyes narrowing. Layering, he murmured. Classic. Break large movements into smaller, forgettable ones. Disperse them across multiple channels. hide intention behind volume. He smiled faintly. Eleanor wasn't improvising, she was executing. He opened a new encrypted file. Case EH. No hesitation, no sentiment, just facts. Transaction by transaction, he began documenting everything. Dates, amounts, destinations, cross-referencing each movement with internal reports, tax filings, and third-party accounts. Hours passed without him noticing, because this was familiar. This was the same mindset that had made him successful, not chasing KCs, but organizing it. By the end of the first week, a shape began to emerge. A network. Not random, not sloppy, deliberate. Funds were being funneled into shell entities, clean names legitimate on paper, but hollow underneath. From there they were redirected again, offshore. Mark followed the trail patiently. Jurisdiction by jurisdiction, layer by layer. Until finally, he found it. An account. Cayman Islands. Not in Eleanor's name? Of course not. But connected, indirectly, carefully, provably. Mark stared at the screen, a slow exhale leaving his chest. Found you. But he didn't act, not yet, because one account wasn't a case. It was a clue. And Mark didn't need clues. He needed certainty. During the day, the game continued. Eleanor moved closer. Not emotionally, strategically. She asked more questions about the company. Subtle at first, then sharper. Have you thought about restructuring the equity distribution? She asked one evening, swirling a glass of wine as she leaned casually against the kitchen counter. Mark didn't look up from his phone. Not recently, he said. You should, she replied lightly. It might protect you, in case something unexpected happens. He almost smiled. Almost. Instead, he nodded. Maybe you're right. She watched him carefully, measuring, waiting. But Mark gave her nothing. No resistance, no suspicion, just trust. The same trust she believed she was exploiting. That night, after she fell asleep, Mark returned to the study. But this time, he didn't open his laptop. He opened something else. A small, nearly invisible device. Audio recorder. He turned it over in his hand. Light. Unassuming. Powerful. For a moment, he hesitated. Not because of legality, not because of morality, but because of what it represented. A line crossed. A point of no return. Then he thought of her voice. He trusts me, that's his weakness. Mark pressed the button. A soft red light blinked to life. The next morning he placed it carefully. Not in the obvious places. Not in the bedroom. Too risky. Too predictable. Instead, the living room, near the space where voices carried just enough. Where conversations felt safe. Where mistakes could happen. Days turned into a pattern. Observe, record, analyze, repeat. The recordings were enlightening. Not immediate confessions, not careless slips, but fragments, pieces of a larger truth. Timing has to be perfect, Eleanor's voice murmured one afternoon. A pause, then Daniel. You're sure he won't notice a soft laugh? He never does. Mark listened to that clip 3 times, not because it hurt, but because it confirmed something critical. They were comfortable, and comfort made people careless. By the second week, Mark had more than suspicions. He had data. Financial trails, audio fragments, behavioral patterns. But still, he waited. Because strategy wasn't about reacting to what you knew. It was about knowing when what you had was enough. One evening, Eleanor approached him again. This time closer than usual, more intentional. Mark, she said softly, sitting across from him. There's something I've been thinking about. He looked up. Calm. Attentive? Yeah. She hesitated just enough to seem genuine. I think we should revisit the ownership structure, for both our sakes. There it was, not subtle anymore, a step forward. Mark leaned back slightly, studying her. How so? She smiled gently. We simplify things, transfer certain assets, make everything cleaner, more efficient. Efficient. The word lingered, cold, clinical, final. Mark held her gaze. For a fraction of a second, just a fraction. Something sharper flickered beneath his calm exterior. Not anger, not pain, awareness. Then it was gone, replaced by something she recognized, something she trusted. Okay, he said. Eleanor blinked. Just once. A micro-expression? Surprise? She hadn't expected it to be that easy. You're okay with it? She asked carefully. Mark nodded. Yeah, if it makes things better. A pause, then deliberately, we can go over the details soon. Her smile returned, wider this time, more real, because in her mind, the endgame had just moved closer. She stood leaning down to kiss him lightly. Thank you, she whispered. Mark watched her walk away, listened to her footsteps fade, waited until the house settled into silence. Then he stood, walked to the study, closed the door. The notebook lay where he left it. He opened it slowly, turned to a new page, and wrote Phase 1 complete. Below it, assets identified, accounts traced, behavioral patterns confirmed, a pause. Then Phase 2 engagement. Mark set the pen down. His reflection stared back at him from the darkened window. Not the man from before. Not the husband, not the victim. Something far more dangerous, because Eleanor believed she was dismantling him piece by piece. What she didn't realize was that every move she made was being recorded, cataloged, and prepared for a moment she would never see coming. Mark closed the notebook, and this time he didn't smile. He simply turned off the light and let the darkness settle, because in the dark, no one could see the shift. No one could see the plan. But it was already in motion. By the third week, Mark Sullivan had perfected the art of existing in two realities at once. In one, he was still the husband Eleanor believed she controlled, predictable, trusting, quietly preoccupied with the expansion of his PR empire in New York City. He attended meetings, answered emails, and came home at reasonable hours. He laughed when expected. He listened when spoken to. In the other, he was dismantling her. The transition between those two versions of himself became seamless, almost effortless. Dinner tonight? Eleanor asked one morning standing by the kitchen island, her tone light casual. Mark glanced up from his phone. I might be late. Client meeting? A lie. She nodded unfazed. No problem. I'll be out too. Of course you will, he thought, but he only smiled. Text me when you're heading back. I always do, she said. Another lie. By 7:30 p.m. Mark wasn't at a client meeting. He was seated in a private conference room 30 floors above Midtown, the skyline reflecting in the glass walls like a fractured mirror. Across from him sat two people who had never existed in Eleanor's world. And never would. Let's go over it again, said Laura Bennett, a forensic accountant with a reputation for turning financial illusions into courtroom weapons. Her voice was calm, precise, cut from the same cloth as Mark's. Next to her, Jonathan Pierce, corporate attorney, flipped through a stack of documents, his expression unreadable. Mark leaned back slightly. Start with the offshore structure. Laura nodded, sliding a file across the table. We've confirmed at least 4 shell entities connected indirectly to Eleanor, she said. All routed through layered transactions, clean on the surface but traceable with enough pressure. Mark opened the file. Rows of numbers. Dates. Entities with names that meant nothing and everything. She's good, Laura added. Whoever helped her set this up knew exactly how to avoid immediate detection. Mark didn't look up. I know who. Jonathan spoke next. The bigger issue isn't just the money, he said. It's the legal groundwork she's been laying. That got Mark's attention. He lifted his gaze. Explain. Jonathan slid another document forward. Transfer agreements. Drafted but not yet executed. They're structured to appear voluntary mutual restructuring for tax efficiency and asset protection. Mark scanned the page. His name, her name, legal language so polished it almost felt benign. Almost. If you signed these, Jonathan continued, you'd essentially be handing over controlling interest in multiple assets including parts of your company. A pause. Then quieter, and you'd have very little recourse afterward. Silence settled over the room. Not heavy. Focused. Mark closed the document slowly. She's planning to time it with the financial transfers, he said. Laura nodded. Exactly. By the time you realize what's happened, the money's gone, and the paperwork makes it look like you agreed to everything. Mark exhaled once. Controlled. Measured. Forgery, he asked. Jonathan shook his head. Not exactly. More like manipulation. These are real documents. She just needs your signature. Mark leaned back, eyes narrowing slightly. She won't force it, he said. She'll convince me. And she was already trying. Later that night, Mark returned home. The lights were dim. Soft jazz played somewhere in the background. Eleanor stood by the window, a glass of wine in hand, her silhouette framed against the city lights. It looked like a scene from a movie. Perfect. Intentional? You're late, she said softly, turning toward him. Meeting ran over Mark, replied, setting his keys down. Another lie. Another layer. She studied him for a moment, then smiled. I missed you. Mark walked over slowly, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence, far enough to remain untouched. Yeah, he said. She stepped closer. Of course. Her hand rested lightly against his chest, steady, confident, as if she still owned this space, owned him. You've been distant lately? She added, her voice softer now. Is everything okay? There it was. Not concern. Calibration. Mark held her gaze. Let the silence stretch just enough to feel real. Then just work, he said. You know how it gets. Eleanor searched his face, looking for cracks, for doubt, for awareness, but Mark gave her nothing. She nodded slowly. I do. Then, as if shifting gears effortlessly, I've been thinking more about what we talked about, she said. The restructuring? Mark tilted his head slightly. Yeah. She moved away, picking up a folder from the table. Prepared. Of course she was. I had some preliminary documents drafted, she said casually. Nothing final, just something to look at. Mark accepted the folder, opened it, recognized it instantly. Jonathan's copy. But cleaner, simpler, more persuasive. This could protect us? Eleanor continued. Simplify everything. Make sure we're both secure. Secure. The word almost made him laugh. He flipped through the pages slowly, carefully, as if seeing them for the first time. Looks complicated, he said. She stepped closer again. It's not, she replied gently. I'll walk you through everything. Mark closed the folder, met her eyes, and for the briefest moment, he let something flicker beneath the surface. Not suspicion, not yet, just hesitation. Maybe he said, Let me think about it. Eleanor paused, a fraction too long, then smiled. Of course, she said smoothly. Take your time. But her eyes had changed, just slightly, because this wasn't part of her plan. That night after she fell asleep, Mark returned to the study. The folder lay open on his desk, waiting. He didn't touch it, not immediately. Instead, he opened his laptop and joined a secure call. Laura and Jonathan appeared on screen. She gave you the documents Laura asked. Mark nodded. Exactly as expected. Jonathan leaned forward slightly. Then we're close. Mark considered that. Close, yes. But not finished. There's more, Mark said. I know it. Laura frowned. What makes you say that? Mark reached for his notebook, flipped to a page filled with notes, patterns, connections. Then he tapped a specific line. Daniel Reeves, he said. He's not just a lover. Silence. He's inside the company, Mark continued. Closer than we thought. Jonathan's expression sharpened. How close? Mark looked up, and this time there was no trace of the man Eleanor believed she controlled. Close enough, he said quietly, to forge internal documents. The room went still. Show me, Laura said. Mark turned the notebook toward the screen, pointing, explaining, connecting the dots, invoices that didn't align, authorizations that felt off, digital signatures that were technically valid but contextually impossible. By the time he finished, there was no doubt left. This isn't just financial manipulation, Jonathan said slowly. It's fraud. Mark nodded once, on multiple levels. Laura leaned back, exhaling. She's not just trying to take your money, she said. She's trying to take your entire identity, your company, your reputation, everything. Mark didn't respond, because he already knew. The call ended shortly after. The plan was evolving. Mark sat alone in the dark, the city lights flickering beyond the glass, the folder still open. Eleanor asleep just down the hall. 2 lives, 1 man. He picked up his pen, turned to a new page, and wrote Phase 2 expanded. Below it, financial fraud confirmed. Internal manipulation detected. Daniel embedded. A pause. Then next exposure strategy. Mark closed the notebook, leaning back in his chair, eyes fixed on the ceiling. Eleanor believed she was playing a flawless game, a perfect plan, a controlled narrative, but she had made one mistake. Not emotional, not impulsive, strategic. She had assumed that Mark Sullivan would react like a husband. Instead, he was thinking like something else entirely. And by the time she realized it, it would already be too late. Tension, Mark Sullivan realized, didn't explode. It accumulated, quietly, invisibly, like pressure beneath the ocean floor, until one shift, one crack, and everything collapsed. By the fourth week, the house had become a controlled battlefield. Nothing was openly hostile, nothing was visibly broken, but every word, every glance, every silence carried weight. Eleanor moved through their life with increasing confidence. That was the first change Mark noticed. Not carelessness. Not yet, but certainty. "You've been distracted lately?" she said one evening, her voice light as she placed a plate in front of him. Mark looked up slowly. "Have I?" A simple question, but deliberate. She smiled faintly, taking her seat across from him. "Just a little," she replied. "Work, I assume." Mark held her gaze, counted the seconds. 1, 2, 3. Then, not just work. The shift was microscopic, but he saw it. A flicker behind her eyes, gone almost instantly. "Oh," she said, tilting her head slightly. "What else?" Mark leaned back, resting his arm casually along the chair. "I've been thinking about us." There it was, the first real move. Eleanor didn't freeze. She didn't panic. She adapted. Of course she did. "That's a good thing, isn't it?" she said gently. Mark watched her carefully. Every micro-expression, every breath. "I'm not sure," he replied. Silence settled between them. Not awkward, measured. "Why would you say that?" Eleanor asked softly. Mark let the question linger, then answered, "Because I'm starting to realize I don't know everything." Another flicker, this time slightly stronger. Eleanor set her fork down. Carefully, controlled. "What do you think you don't know?" she asked. Mark met her eyes directly. No smile, no softness, just calm. "You tell me." The air shifted, subtly, but unmistakably. For a brief moment, Eleanor Hart had no script. Then she smiled. It was almost impressive. The speed, the precision. "Mark," she said, her tone softening. "You're scaring me a little." Deflection. Emotional inversion. Make him the problem. He didn't react. "I'm serious," she continued. "If something's bothering you, just tell me. Don't do this." Mark leaned forward slightly, close enough that she couldn't look away. "Are you hiding anything from me direct?" Clean, irreversible. A pause, 1 second too long. Then no. The answer came quickly, firmly, without hesitation, too perfect. Mark studied her face, looking for cracks. But Eleanor had mastered this. Her expression held. Her breathing stayed even, her eyes clear. "You're sure?" he asked, a hint of pressure, just enough. Eleanor exhaled softly, shaking her head with a faint, almost disappointed smile. "Of course I am," she said. "Why would you even ask that?" There it was again. Turn the question back, make him doubt himself. Mark sat back, let the silence stretch. "Then I heard something the other night." This time she felt it, not visibly, not dramatically. But inside, something shifted. "What do you mean?" she asked. Careful now. Measured. Mark watched her closely. "I came home early," he said. "You weren't here." "True. Technically." Eleanor nodded slowly. "I told you I had a late meeting." "Yes," Mark said. "You did." Another pause. "But that's not what I'm talking about." Her fingers tightened slightly around the edge of the table. Barely noticeable, but real. "Then what are you talking about?" she asked. Mark held her gaze, unblinking. I heard voices. Silence. A long one. Eleanor didn't move, didn't blink, didn't breathe, for just a fraction of a second. Then she laughed, soft, light, dismissive. "Mark," seriously, she said, shaking her head. "You must have imagined it." Gaslighting, immediate, confident. Mark didn't smile. "I don't think I did." Her expression shifted just slightly. Not defensive, concerned. "Okay," she said gently, leaning forward now. "Let's think about this logically." Logical. She was meeting him on his ground now. "You came home late. You were probably tired. Maybe you heard something from outside neighbors." The street, it was inside the house. Cut. Clean. Another pause. Eleanor's eyes searched his face, looking for doubt, for weakness, for something she could use. But Mark gave her nothing. "You're overthinking this," she said finally, her tone soft but firm. There was no one here. No one. The lie sat between them. Heavy. Undeniable. Mark leaned back slowly, as if considering her words, as if weighing them. Then, "Okay, just that." Eleanor blinked. Once. "That's it?" she asked. Mark nodded. Yeah, too easy. She studied him now, more carefully, because something didn't feel right, but she couldn't see it, and that was the problem. Mark, she said quietly, if something's going on with you, you can tell me. There it was again. Concern, care, control. He almost admired it. I know, he said. And then he stood. I've got some work to finish. No argument, no escalation, no resolution, just distance. Eleanor watched him walk away, her expression unreadable, but her mind racing, because for the first time she wasn't entirely sure where she stood, and uncertainty was something she wasn't used to. Later that night, Mark sat alone in the study. The audio recorder lay on the desk. Beside it, his notebook. He pressed play. He's starting to ask questions. Eleanor's voice whispered through the speaker. Mark didn't react. Daniel's voice followed. Is that a problem? A pause. Then, no, Eleanor said. I can handle him. Mark's jaw tightened slightly. He trusts you, Daniel asked. A soft exhale. Almost amused. Completely. The recording clicked off. Silence returned. Mark stared at the device for a long moment, then reached for his pen. Phase 3. Active pressure. Below it, subject maintains denial under direct questioning. Gaslighting confirmed. Confidence remains high. A pause. Then cracks beginning to form. Mark closed the notebook, leaning back in his chair. Eyes fixed on nothing. He had what he needed, almost. Not just evidence, not just proof. But something more important. Timing. Because Eleanor was still playing the game. Still confident. Still in control. And that was exactly where he needed her to be. Right before everything fell apart. Control, Mark Sullivan had learned, was never about what people saw. It was about what they expected to see, and then taking that expectation and turning it against them. The invitation went out on a Monday morning. By noon, half of Manhattan had seen it. Sullivan's strategic annual expansion. Announcement. Location, private ballroom, Upper East Side, New York City. Attendees, investors, legal partners, media, industry executives. To the public, it was just another milestone, another success story, another polished display of Mark Sullivan's growing empire. To Eleanor, it was something else entirely. This is perfect, she said, standing in the living room, her eyes scanning the digital invitation on her tablet. Mark stood near the window, adjusting his cufflinks. Yeah, he replied calmly. Felt like the right time. She looked up at him. There it was again. That quiet satisfaction. That certainty. You're finally ready? She asked. Mark met her gaze, held it. Just long enough. I think so. Eleanor smiled. Slow, measured, victorious. Because in her mind, this wasn't just an event. This was the end. The moment he would sign. The moment everything would transfer. The moment Mark Sullivan would unknowingly hand over his empire. In front of the very people who admired him. And the beauty of it, he thought it was his idea. Jonathan confirmed the documents are ready, she asked casually. Mark nodded. They'll be there. Another lie. Another layer. Eleanor stepped closer, her voice softening. I'm proud of you. You know, she said. Mark didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at her, studied the woman who had spent weeks dismantling his life, while standing right beside him. You should be, he said finally. She didn't catch the difference. But it was there. That night, after Eleanor went to bed, Mark didn't return to the study. Not immediately. Instead, he stood alone in the darkened living room, the city lights flickering beyond the glass. This was it. No more observation, no more waiting. Now, it became execution. He picked up his phone, dialed. Laura answered on the second ring. Tell me it's time. Mark's voice was calm, steady, final. It's time. A pause. Then walk me through it again, she said. Mark moved slowly as he spoke, pacing the room like a man rehearsing something far more than logistics. Guest list is confirmed, he said. Investors, board members, press. Everyone who matters. And Eleanor, Laura asked. She thinks it's a signing event. A beat. Then good Laura replied. Mark stopped walking. His reflection stared back at him from the glass. The documents she expects, Laura continued. Will be there, Mark said. Just not the ones she thinks. Across the city in another office, Jonathan Pierce was already preparing the final pieces. Legal filings, certified evidence, financial records, audio transcripts, everything had been verified. Time-stamped, impossible to deny. They won't be able to walk out of that room untouched, Jonathan had said earlier. Mark didn't need them to be touched. He needed them to be exposed, because exposure was irreversible. Back in the house, the call ended. Silence returned. Mark stood there for a long moment, then turned and walked upstairs. Eleanor was still awake, sitting in bed, reading, waiting. "You're up late," she said softly as he entered. "Just finishing things," he replied. She set the book down, watched him. "Are you nervous?" she asked. Mark loosened his tie slightly. "Should I be—" A small smile curved her lips. "It's a big step," she said. "Letting go of control like that." Mark paused, just for a second. Then, "Yeah," he said. "It is." She studied him, searching, measuring. "You trust me, right?" she asked again. The same question, the same tone. But this time it meant something different. Mark walked closer, sat on the edge of the bed, looked at her, really looked. And for the first time there was no flicker of the man she thought she knew. Only something colder, deeper, unreachable. "Completely," he said. Eleanor smiled, satisfied, certain. She leaned in, pressing a soft kiss to his lips. "Good," she whispered. Mark didn't kiss her back. Not really. But she didn't notice. Because she had already won, or at least that's what she believed. The night passed quietly. Too quietly. Because beneath that silence, everything was already in motion. The event was set. The players were in place, the narrative about to be rewritten. And Eleanor Hart, standing at the center of it all, had no idea that she wasn't walking into a victory. She was walking onto a stage, and Mark Sullivan was about to turn the spotlight on. The ballroom shimmered with curated perfection. Crystal chandeliers cast soft light over polished marble floors. Waiters moved like clockwork, offering champagne to a carefully selected crowd: investors, executives, legal minds, and media figures who thrived on proximity to power. Everything looked exactly the way it was supposed to, which was precisely why no one saw it coming. Mark Sullivan stood near the center of it all, calm, composed, untouchable. To the room he was the architect of success, the man who had built something from nothing in New York City and turned reputation into currency. To Eleanor, he was something else. She stood beside him, radiant in a tailored ivory dress, her hand resting lightly on his arm. The perfect wife, the perfect partner, the perfect illusion. "Everyone's here," she murmured, her voice soft but edged with anticipation. Mark glanced across the room. Laura Bennett stood near the back, blending seamlessly into the crowd. Jonathan Pierce was closer to the stage, speaking quietly with two men in dark suits, federal, discreet, observant. Daniel Reeves arrived moments later, confident, relaxed, smiling as if he already owned the future. Mark watched him approach, measured, unhurried. Mark Daniel greeted, extending a hand. Daniel Mark replied, shaking it firmly. No hesitation, no tension, nothing that could betray what was about to unfold. Eleanor's fingers tightened slightly around Mark's arm. Subtle, possessive. "This is it," she whispered. Mark turned to her, and for a fleeting second, he saw it clearly. Not love, not partnership, victory. He smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah," he said. "It is." Moments later, the room settled. The low hum of conversation faded as Mark stepped onto the stage. A microphone, a spotlight, every eye on him. This was familiar territory. "Good evening," he began, his voice smooth, controlled. "Thank you all for being here tonight." A ripple of polite applause. Mark let it pass, then continued. "When I started this company, I believed in one thing above all else: trust." Eleanor stood below the stage watching him, her expression proud, confident, certain. "Trust between partners," Mark continued. "Trust between clients, and most importantly, trust between the people closest to you." A subtle shift moved through the room. Nothing obvious, but something different. Mark's gaze drifted, landed on Eleanor, held. For a long time, he said, "I thought that trust was unbreakable." Eleanor's smile flickered. "Just slightly." "Until recently," Mark added. Silence followed, the kind that doesn't ask for attention but demands it. Mark stepped away from the podium, closer to the edge of the stage. "And tonight," he said, "I want to talk about what happens when that trust is misplaced." The room stilled. Eleanor's posture shifted. Barely, but enough. Daniel frowned slightly. Mark reached into his jacket, pulled out a small remote, and pressed a button. The screen behind him came to life. At first just numbers, financial data, transaction logs, dates, amounts. Confusion rippled through the audience. This, Mark said calmly, is a pattern of financial movement over the past 3 months. Another click. The data zoomed, highlighted, connected, layered transactions, he continued. Routed through shell entities, designed to avoid detection. Whispers began. Eleanor didn't move, didn't speak, but her eyes locked onto the screen. No one noticed, Mark said, because no one was supposed to. Another click. Names appeared, entities, connections, and then a single account, offshore. The room shifted. This account, Mark said, is where the money ends up. Silence, heavy now, unavoidable. Eleanor took a step forward. Just one, Mark, she said softly. A warning, a plea, a calculation. He didn't look at her. Legally structured, he continued. Carefully executed. Almost flawless. Another click. A new image appeared. Documents, contracts, signatures. Transfer agreements, Mark said. Prepared in advance. Designed to make the theft look voluntary. Gasps. Quiet, controlled, but real. Daniel stepped forward now. Mark, what the hell is this? He demanded. Mark finally looked at him. Calm, unshaken. The truth he said. Another click. The screen changed again. This time audio. Eleanor's voice filled the room. He trusts me, that's his weakness. The effect was immediate. The room didn't just go quiet. It collapsed into silence. Eleanor froze. Daniel's face drained of color. By the time he realizes what happened, everything will be legally protected. The recording continued. Relentless, precise, unforgiving. Mark didn't move, didn't speak, didn't need to, because the truth was speaking for him. When the audio stopped, no one breathed. Eleanor stepped forward, her composure cracking for the first time. This isn't what it looks like, she said quickly. Too quickly. Mark turned to her slowly. Then what is it, he asked. Direct, unavoidable. She swallowed, eyes darting, searching for something, anything to hold on to. You're misunderstanding. This was taken out of context, Daniel and I. Daniel, and you? What? Mark cut in. Her voice faltered. The room watched, not with curiosity anymore, with judgment. Daniel stepped back, instinctively, creating distance. Cowardice, Mark noted. Eleanor turned toward him, desperate. Say something, she whispered. Daniel didn't, because there was nothing left to say. Mark stepped down from the stage, each step slow, measured, final. He stopped in front of her, close enough that only she could hear the next words. I asked you, he said quietly, if you were hiding anything. Her eyes filled, but not with regret. Not yet. With fear. I gave you a chance. A pause. You chose to lie. Eleanor's lips trembled. Mark, please. But it was too late. Behind them, movement. The two men in dark suits stepped forward. Eleanor. Heart, one of them said. She turned. Confused. Terrified. You're being formally investigated for financial fraud conspiracy and asset manipulation. The words landed like a verdict. Daniel tried to step away. Daniel Reeves, the second man said. Don't leave. The room watched as power shifted. Completely. Irreversibly. Eleanor looked back at Mark, her voice breaking now. You did this? Mark met her gaze. No, he said calmly. You did. And just like that, the illusion shattered. The perfect wife, the flawless image, the untouchable plan, gone, replaced by truth, raw, public, unforgiving. Eleanor Hart didn't just lose control. She lost everything. And Mark Sullivan. Never raised his voice, never lost his composure. But in that moment, he won. The silence after the fall was louder than the collapse itself. It lingered in the ballroom long after the agents escorted Eleanor and Daniel away. Conversations didn't resume, they fractured. Whispers replaced admiration. Eyes that once held respect now carried something colder, judgment. Mark Sullivan didn't stay. He didn't need to. By the time the press began circling the story, he was already gone, stepping out into the cool night air of New York City, where the city moved forward as if nothing had happened. But everything had. 3 days later, Eleanor saw him again. The room was smaller this time, colder, stripped of illusion. No chandeliers, No audience. Just a steel table, muted walls, and the quiet hum of consequence. Eleanor Hart no longer looked like the woman from the ballroom. Her hair was tied back hastily. Her eyes red, hollow, restless. The confidence she once wore like armor had been stripped away, leaving something raw beneath it. Something human. Too late. Mark sat across from her. Composed, still, untouched. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, why, Eleanor asked. Her voice broke on the word. Mark didn't respond immediately. He simply looked at her, not with anger, not with sadness, with clarity. You already know why, he said. She shook her head quickly. No, I mean, why like this? She whispered. Why didn't you just talk to me? Mark leaned back slightly, studying her. I did, he said calmly. You lied, Ott. The words landed softly. But they didn't need force. Eleanor's breath caught. I was scared, she said, her voice trembling now. You don't understand what it's like to feel invisible, to build something with someone and still feel like you don't exist in it. Mark didn't interrupt. You were always in control, she continued. The company, the decisions, everything. I had nothing that was mine. Her hands clenched slightly on the table. I didn't want to destroy you, she said quickly. I just wanted something for myself. Mark's gaze didn't shift. So you took everything from me, he asked. Direct, clean. Eleanor flinched. That's not what you planned it? Mark cut in. For months, her voice faltered. You involved someone else, he continued. You built a system designed to erase me financially, legally, completely. Each word was precise, measured. And now, you're telling me, he said quietly, it wasn't about destroying me. Silence. Eleanor's composure cracked. I made a mistake, she whispered. Mark shook his head once. No, he said. A pause. You made a series of decisions. The distinction hung in the air. Sharp, unforgiving. Tears slid down her face now. Uncontrolled, desperate. Mark, please, she said. I'll fix it. I'll tell them everything. I'll give it all back. Just don't let this be the end. He watched her. Really watched her. Not the woman he married. Not the partner he trusted. Just the person sitting in front of him. You already gave everything away, he said. Her breath hitched. Not the money, Mark added. A beat. Yourself. The words broke something in her. I loved you, she said, almost pleading now. That wasn't a lie. Mark's expression didn't change. Maybe not at the beginning, he said. Another pause. But somewhere along the way, it stopped being enough. Eleanor shook her head violently. No, that's not true. You don't destroy people you love, Mark said. Silence. Complete. Final. Eleanor's shoulders collapsed inward. Her voice reduced to something barely audible. I'm sorry. For the first time, it sounded real, but it changed nothing. Mark stood. The movement was quiet, but decisive. Eleanor looked up at him, panic flooding her expression. You're just walking away, she asked. Mark adjusted his jacket slightly. I already did, he said. Her lips parted, but no words came out, because deep down she understood. This wasn't anger, this wasn't revenge, this was absence, and there was nothing more final than that. Mark, she tried again, but he was already turning, walking toward the door, each step steady, unhurried, unstoppable. He didn't look back, not once, because there was nothing left behind worth seeing. Weeks later, the headlines told the story the world needed to hear. Fraud, conspiracy, financial manipulation. Eleanor Hart's name became synonymous with scandal. Her accounts frozen, her reputation destroyed, her future irreversibly altered. Daniel Reeves disappeared from public view, but not from consequence, and Mark, he remained, not untouched, but unbroken. His company stabilized, his name stronger, not weaker, because in a world obsessed with image, he had proven something far more valuable. Truth. One evening, standing alone in his office overlooking the city, Mark allowed himself a single moment of stillness. No anger, no regret, just clarity. He had lost a marriage, but he hadn't lost himself. And in the end, that was the only victory that mattered, because betrayal doesn't destroy you. Not if you see it clearly, Not if you face it without illusion. Not if you choose control over chaos. Mark Sullivan turned off the lights and walked away, this time for good.